Love that. Oh, all right. Welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, August 30th. Very, very happy to see you. My name is Heather Kraus, and I am the founder and CEO of an organization called We All Count. And the purpose of We All Count is to build tools and provide trainings that can help anybody who's working on a data project maximize the amount of equity that they have in that data project. And one of the things that we do is that most Fridays we host this event, which is called Talking Data Equity. This is your first time, welcome. We're very, very happy to have you here. I know we have a lot of first timers because we have a fantastic guest speaker today. If you are a regular, it means the world to me that you are a regular. This is really one of my favorite things to do each week, and it wouldn't be as fun if it was just me by myself. So thank you for coming and being such a curious, kind, interesting part of the internet. We've managed to keep a pretty large Zoom meeting a happy, healthy place for a long time now, and that's really unusual. So thank you for being that community. And essentially, what we do here at Talking Data Equity varies a lot from week to week. And this week, we have a very, very highly requested special guest. And I'm going to introduce a special guest in a minute. And what we're going to ask, because we have a lot of people on a Zoom meeting, is that you keep your microphones turned off while our guest speaker is sharing their slides and their stories, and ask your questions using the Zoom chat. You can go ahead and use the Zoom chat to have conversations, make comments. You can chat away, and then time permitting at the end, we will have a little bit of space for live questions and answers, and you can then raise your hand and turn your microphone on. So cameras, you can do anything you want with your camera. Whatever makes you feel happy and connected, you can do with your camera on or off, whatever works out well for you. Great question. Okay, so let me introduce to you our special guest, which is, again, a long time coming. The only reason our today's special guest, Jon Schwabish, hasn't been on before is that it took us this long to find a date. I know that some of you already are familiar with Jon and his work through his regular participation here at Talking Data Equity and all of the amazing work that he puts out into the world. Dr. Jonathan Schwabish is a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, where he is a researcher in the Income and Benefits Policy Center and a member of the Institute's communication team. His economic research primarily focuses on nutrition policy and policies that affect people with disabilities. And Dr. Schwabish is considered a leader. I'm going to take out the word considered, is a leader in the data visualization field and an advocate for clarity and accessibility in research. And that's one of the reasons that so many of you have asked for him to come on and be a special guest, because he has written extensively about best practices for data visualization. And this includes some really useful hands-on concrete stuff like how to create things, what are the best practices, how to make stuff accessible. And he's got a lot of real world experience, from governments to nonprofits to fancy research institutes. And he has 4 amazing books, one entitled Better Presentations, one entitled Elevate the Debate, one entitled Better Data Visualizations, and one entitled Data Visualizations in Excel. And I could talk a lot more about the impact that Jon has had on my life, which has been very, very positive, and on the work of a lot of people that I also collaborate with. And I'm very, very excited. Oh, and I should also say he has a really, really good podcast called Policy Viz Podcast. If you're like me, heavy consumer of podcasts, highly recommend that one. And just before I turn it over to Jon to share some of his extensive experience, I want to reassure everybody that we are recording this and that in the data equity community forum, I'll put a link to that in the chat right now. We will put the recording there, and we will also put links to all the resources we're talking about. So you can just relax and enjoy this conversation, knowing that you're going to have links to all of the resources that are discussed today in the forum. You don't have to try and capture every single resource or link that we talk about. So you can just hang out, stay present, and we'll make sure that you have the links. So on that note, Jon, thank you for making time in your extremely busy schedule to be with us today.
Thank you, Heather. Really appreciate that introduction. Yeah, we had our time scheduling this, but I will say a lot of it because I did try to relax this summer and had some lovely travel, which I hope other folks are able to do as well. So thanks everybody for coming to this week's Data Equity Talk. Very excited to chat with you. So I'm going to put just a quick link in the chat window here. This is the Do No Harm project that I and others at the Urban Institute have been working on now for the last 3 or so years, including an interview we did with Heather. So Heather's in a couple of those reports. So you'll see Heather's name there as well. And I'm going to talk primarily about sort of the first report in that series. But going to bring in some other more recent work that we've been doing, and I'll also note two other things. That one, we have another report coming out October 4th is the current published date, where we'll be looking at data equity from a sort of more global perspective, because right now it's fairly U.S. Western based. We're going to take sort of a broader view, and then also very excited that my colleague Alice Fang and I, who worked on several of these reports for me, she and I are about to sign a contract on a book on this topic. So we're very excited to start to thread all this together into a new project that we will hopefully have out early next year. So with all that being said, let me bring up my slides. And as Heather mentioned, if you have questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat window. I have the chat window open here so I can respond. So yeah, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about this Do No Harm project work that we've been doing at the Urban Institute now for a few years. This project at the moment consists of 6 separate reports, all about trying to help researchers, data analysts, anyone working in sort of the data analytics or data communication field, improve how they take an equity inclusivity lens to their work. And I'm not going to talk about all these different reports, but I'll just mention quickly what we're trying to do here. So the first report at the very top is the flagship report, the very first one, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. The most recent one, and then we have 2 other sort of sole authored reports. There's a report on data privacy and equity that was co-authored by my colleague at Urban Institute, Claire Bowen, and another colleague at RAND on data privacy and security and how that disproportionately is sort of inequitable is the way it's treated. And then another longer report that I wrote with several colleagues at Urban on sexual orientation and gender identity data, which I will talk a little bit about today, that we published late last year. Interestingly, actually, I'll just real quick on that report. I went into that report as I went into this first report, really thinking about data visualization and how we can take a more equitable approach to communicating and visualizing SOGI data. It turns out, because there's not a lot of good representative SOGI data, that there's not a lot of data visualization techniques to really focus on. And so we actually spent a lot of time in that report talking about how we as either data producers, when we're creating surveys or collecting data, or also data consumers, how we can be more equitable in thinking about sexual orientation and gender data. And then we have 3 other reports that are collections of essays from other folks working in these various fields, thinking about how they try to take an equitable approach to their work or an accessible approach to their work and trying to highlight their voices. So we have 3 reports on centering accessibility, additional perspectives, and then crafting equitable data narratives. And I would encourage you to check out all of these reports and all the fabulous folks that we've worked with over the last few years. With all that being said, let's dive into some content. But before we actually get into content, let me just tell you a little about where this came from. So the sort of origin of this work was born out of the racial justice protests from a few years ago. Alice, who is a data visualization developer, and myself, who's worked, is trained as an economist, worked for the federal government for a long time, and now at Urban. She and I were talking about how we could be a part of this conversation. How could we be a part of this conversation around equity, around inclusivity, around discrimination, stereotypes? And where we sort of landed was that there wasn't a lot of guidance for those of us who are, kind of deep into the data world, about thinking about equity. I mean, if you think about it, like Heather's kind of like the only other person, right, at least at that time, really doing this work sort of in a outward, public way, really talking about this. So there wasn't really a lot of public guidance. And so that's where we sort of sat down and said, this is how we could start, I think, lending our voice to this discussion within our particular community of data visualizers, whatever word we want to use, but the data community generally. Okay, and before I get into content, let me just do a little bit of level setting here. I think it's always important to do this. So I now describe myself, now kind of out of the pandemic, I describe myself as a middle-aged white male. I didn't use the phrase middle-aged a couple of years ago, but now I use middle-aged. So as a middle-aged white male, middle-aged cisgender white male, I should say, actually, my experience is very different than many other people in the US and of course around the world. I will also say that I'm Jewish. I have had my experience with anti-Semitism. We had a governor election here, and I live in Virginia a couple of years ago. Had some experiences then, and so it's still just a very different experience than, for example, being a person of color in the United States. I'm not afraid, for example, of what might happen if I'm pulled over by the police, right? So the experience is just fundamentally different. But as someone who's worked in public policy now for 20 years, thought a lot about these issues, spent a lot of time working obviously in the data visualization community, particularly for public policy and social policy. Just as a member of society and as a dad, like these are the issues we really need to be talking about, we really need to be thinking about. Okay, so before I get into what we did, and as you've seen, there's a lot of work here, and I'm going to focus on the most practical pieces for you. Before I get into what we did, I want to talk about what we didn't do. And what we didn't do in this work is focus on visualizations that are explicitly racist, although there are unfortunately, lots of examples. But I do want to share one of the most famous examples with you. What you see in front of you is an example of a redlining map. I'm sure most of the folks on this call in particular are familiar with at least the term. If you haven't seen a redlining map, this is what they look like. This is a redlining map of Chicago. Redlining maps were created in the 1930s and 1940s by a federal government agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, so it's known as the HOLC. And what the HOLC was responsible for was assessing mortgage risk in major metropolitan areas around the country. And so they created a bunch of maps like this. And basically what they said was the green and the blue areas of the map are areas where banks should feel comfortable loaning, right? Those are low mortgage risk, high value areas. On the other side, neighborhoods earned a red color if there was a single Black or African American person living in that neighborhood. And so it didn't matter what the quality of the housing stock was, didn't matter what the employment rate was, didn't matter what the median income was. If a Black or African American person lived in that neighborhood, it earned a red color, which said to banks that this is a high risk, a low value area, and banks should not be therefore inclined to lend to this area. And so I think when a lot of people look at this map, even understanding that story, they may not necessarily immediately see it as a racist data visualization, because I think a lot of people don't sort of use that lens when they're looking at graphs and charts and maps. But let me show you the description the HOLC wrote about this particular map, although there's similar sentiments that were expressed across all these different maps. And so this is what they wrote about this map of Chicago, and I'll just read it for folks who are walking or in the car. The neighborhood is graded D, so that's the red areas, because of its concentration of Negroes, but the section may improve to a third-class area as this element is forced out. And I think when you see or hear that sentence, you immediately see it as a racist sentence. There's no way around it. That's a racist statement. And yet, I think when most people sort of look at the maps, they don't necessarily see it that way. One of the goals of this do no harm body of work is to help people see how visualizations can be racist, they can be discriminatory, and also how these visualizations can have a long and enduring impact on people and on communities. So this, again, this statement, this map is from 1940, okay? This visualization is from February of 2022. This is from 538. And what they showed in several of these cities, that the segregation that occurred because of redlining back in the early part of the 20th century is still maintained today. So they can say here that over 90% more Black Chicagoans in redline areas than in the surrounding areas. So you can see that these maps from a century ago are still having impacts on segregation, housing quality, wealth inequality, earnings inequality, and so on and so forth. It even extends to environmental impacts. This is March of 2022 from the Washington Post, where they showed that air quality in redline neighborhoods across all of these redline cities were markedly and measurably worse in redline neighborhoods than in non-redline neighborhoods. A couple years earlier, the New York Times looked at a few specific cities. This is several maps of Richmond, where they found that redline neighborhoods had A, less tree cover, B, more paved surfaces, and as a result had higher temperature gradients than the rest of the city. And if the single map doesn't help convince you, NPR had more data, and they looked at all of the cities that were where the whole created maps, and you can see redline neighborhoods have much higher temperature gradients than non-redline areas. And so we have this long and enduring impact. And let's take it even a step further. This is from the markup in October of 22, looking in this case in Kansas City, showing that broadband internet access is worse or lower in redline neighborhoods than in non-redline neighborhoods. So you can see these impacts extend to a lot of different facets of society, not just the economic side, but also the environmental, the climate side, and also, as you can see here, to internet access. Okay, so that's what we didn't do. So let's focus on what we did do. What we did do, and to this date, out of these 6 reports, 7 in a few weeks, I think I've interviewed about 125 people for these different reports. So I've had a lot of experience talking to a lot of people and have learned a ton, which has been great for me personally, but also I hope for people who read these reports. And I think the through line through virtually all of those conversations is the idea of demonstrating empathy for the people and the communities that you are working with and that you are trying to communicate with. And this quote from Kim Bui, who's a data journalist now based in Arizona, I think really sums this up really well. If I were one of the data points on this visualization, would I feel offended, right? And I think this is just a good grounding point for all of us as we are thinking about our work when it comes to communicating data. Think about how you might be described in words, in the colors that are used, the icons that are used, in the description of the entire visualization. Picture yourself as that person being described. And if you would feel offended, that's a way to start thinking about how you might want to change some of those aspects of your data communication work, be it a report, a brief, a tweet, a data visualization, a dashboard, whatever it might be. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of content here. And what I'm going to try to do is focus on, I think what I think are the most practical things that come out of especially this first report. So again, I hope you'll go in and read the reports. We do talk about sort of some bigger things about how funders and foundations should be thinking about these issues, how journal editors and journal peer reviewers in the academic world should be thinking about these issues. But my hope is, well, it's Friday, so maybe not this afternoon, but next week when you come back to your office and you get back to work, that you can start to incorporate at least some of the ideas and the concepts, and maybe even some of these, if you view them as recommendations, right directly into your work. So I'm going to start with language. I think language is just a natural way to think about this topic of viewing your visualizations, viewing your data work through an equity and inclusivity lens. And we've seen lots of changes over the last few years when it comes to language. For example, a lot of us have moved away from identity first language towards people first language. So instead of saying disabled person, we might say people with disabilities as just one example. But the challenge with language, and I'm going to focus on the English language, but it's not just the English language. The challenge with language is that it's always evolving and it's changing and it's nuanced. And words or phrases we use today may not be words or phrases we used yesterday and may not be words or phrases that we use tomorrow. Even today, when we think about using people first language, that's not necessarily true for all groups. So in the disability community, for example, there are lots of people who argue that we should use the phrase people with disability. That's not even true within that, if you sort of view that as a broad community, it's not even true within that broad community. This is just a top part of an infographic from the Autism for Autism research, which works on behalf of autistic people. And I use that phrase autistic people rather than people with autism, because in the survey of their members of their interest group, it's about a survey of about 1,100 people, they found that more than 80% of respondents said that they prefer identity first language. So, and Dorian just mentioned the same sort of thing, right? At the Urban Institute, we were using people first language, and now we've sort of moved towards identity first language. And so, as you can see here, that it's a challenge. I mean, it is obviously a challenge, and I'm not going to talk about this at length, but one of the bigger threads and recommendations that kind of comes through is the one way we can figure out whether, for example, we should use the phrase person with autism or autistic person is to talk to people. And that may be a foreign idea, especially to economists in the room, like we just download data and we start writing code and we don't actually talk to people. But the more we can talk to people and talk to communities, the more we can better understand what these preferred phrases and words are. Another good example is the evolution in the words Hispanic, Latino, and Latinx. So prior to like the 1970s, at least in the US, federal data agencies would refer to people by their country or area of origins. You'd have Cuban American, you'd have Mexican American. And through a confluence of events in the 1970s, we started using these words Hispanic and Latino. And over the last few years, we've seen an evolution towards this word Latinx. And the purpose of the word Latinx is to get around the binary gender suffix of the word Latino and Latina. But a lot of people complain that the word is hard to pronounce, that it's not really owned by the Hispanic Latino population. And there's a variety of other complaints about it. But the question for me is, what does this word, or how do people who identify as Hispanic or Latino feel about this word that's being used to describe their particular ethnic group? Well, turns out the first bit of data that I could find on this is from 2020, August of 2020. And so the Pew Research Center asked people who self-identified as Hispanic or Latino what they felt about the word Latinx. And 2/3 of their respondents said that the word Latinx should not be used to describe their particular population. So that's August of 2020. About a year later, Gallup ran a similar poll. Again, they asked people who self-identified as Hispanic or Latino what words they used to describe their particular group. 23% said Hispanic, 15% said Latino, 4% said Latinx, and 57% said it does not matter. And then Gallup did something just so smart. They said, okay, but if you had to choose, what would you choose? Now you see a big shift here. 57% said Hispanic, 37% Latino, only 5% they said they prefer the word Latinx. 2% said they still have no opinion. I wish they did like a third question that was like, no, we're really serious this time. You're like, you have to answer. But you could see really like limited support for this word Latinx. And then finally, this is from December of 2021. This is from a Democratic Party polling firm, so I take it with a little bit of a grain of salt here. But you can see, again, among people who self-identify as Hispanic and Latino, only 2% said that they prefer the word Latinx, and about 40% said that the word Latinx bothers or offends them at least a little bit. So at least from these 3 data points, we can see there's fairly limited support for this word Latinx, for whom that word is supposed to describe. And I'll say, like, I've given talks where I've had people sitting next to each other in an audience, one person saying they really like the word Latinx, and the person next to them saying they hate the word Latinx. So like again, this is hard. I see lots of conversation going on in the chat window, which is terrific. Is, you know, talking to people is one of the ways that we can't resolve this issue, but at least we can sort of better understand it. And now, of course, as Marlene actually got to my point, we've seen the growth in the word Latine, which again is trying to get around the binary suffix. but I haven't seen any representative data, I think, that suggests whether people are supportive of this word or not. And I'll also say one last thing is that all the data I just showed you is supposed to be nationally representative, but I'm sure that it varies by region and it varies by age and it varies by generation. So again, this can be really hard if you're doing research that's supposed to be nationally representative. But if you're doing research on the experience in Chicago or in Southern California or in wherever, again, when you have a more detailed, refined definition of the geography or the people that you're working with or studying, this is a way that you can actually go out and ask people. So now let's talk about data visualization, how this applies in data visualization. What you see in front of you is the top third of a Tableau dashboard. There are 3 maps in this dashboard. This one is labeled black. And I'm going to zoom in here in a second so you can read the label here. But I just want to give you a little data viz 101 so you know what you're looking at. What you see here is what's called a bivariate choropleth map. So you've all seen maps like this before. These shaded maps, they kind of have a strange name. A choropleth map basically says we're going to shade each of the geographic areas, in this case, the different states in the US, by the data value. So in this case, I'm using a blue sequential color palette. Light blue colors correspond to low values. Dark colors correspond to high unemployment rates. So that's a choropleth map. And so this is a bivariate choropleth map. And a bivariate choropleth map is doing the same thing. It's ascribing color, in this case, to each county. But instead of one variable, we now have 2 variables. So let me zoom in on the legend. And so what we have here is 2 variables. On the vertical dimension is the label more poverty. So that's the poverty rate in each county. And along the horizontal dimension is the label more black. So that's the percentage or proportion of people who identify as Black or African American in each county. So the way you read this map is counties that have a lower proportion of people who identify as Black or African American and a lower poverty rate are in that kind of yellowish, orangish color in the bottom left of this grid. And so that tends to be kind of like the upper Midwest, Rocky Mountain areas of the country. And then counties that have a higher poverty rate and a higher density of Black residents is in that very, very dark purple color. And that tends to be in the southeastern part of the states. Okay, so now I've equipped you. You now know how to read a bivariate choropleth map. So I've got that, you've got that now in your hip pocket. All right, let's look at the words that are used here. Along the vertical dimension, the phrase more poverty. So it just should be noted that poverty is an experience. It's not a static description of who a person or who a household is, right? My household income can place me below the poverty line this year, but not necessarily next year. And more importantly for this first report is the phrase more Black, right? And the phrase Black, that phrase references skin color, not people. And again, I think it's just a good grounding point to think about how would you feel, pick whatever your identity is, whatever your characteristics are, how would you feel if you were described in that way? I mean, for me, more Jewish, more Jew is yeah, I do not want to be described that way, right? So it's just a good grounding point to sort of how would you feel if you were described in this way? So what are some alternatives? I mean, there are infinite alternatives, right? We just picked out 2 just to be kind of straightforward and sort of parallel here. Larger proportion of the Black population, larger proportion of people in poverty. I admit they're longer, they're more verbose, they don't kind of fit as nicely on the legend or maybe in a table or in a bar chart. But again, if we're thinking about how people are going to see themselves in the data, and we want them to know that they are being respected and they are being valued in our visualizations, then we need to think about how they would feel, how they would see themselves in the data. I'll also say that we, especially on the data communication, on the data dissemination side, we are not bound by what others have done. We are not bound by the way the Census Bureau collects these data. Okay, and I just want to show you 2 very quick examples. This is from I don't know if they're on Twitter anymore, but on Instagram, it's India in Pixels. I don't know anything about India, but I love this feed because I learn a lot about India really quickly. And I just want to zoom in on the legend here, right? I love this word wise men for folks who are 90 and above. I know it's gendered, but I still love the fact that like we can use other words rather than, elderly, rather than senior citizen. It's just a more positive, affirming word. And I'll give you one more. This is the ticket window from a botanical gardens near my house here in Virginia. I am not yet 55. But my birthday, when I turn 55, I'm going to get a ticket because I want to get the super adult ticket and I just want to be called that, right? So like, again, we're not bound by how the Census Bureau or whatever data set you uses those terms. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but just want to remind you that, again, language is nuanced, language is evolving, language is changing. And so we have this freedom as data communicators to take a different perspective on this. I'm going to keep going. I haven't seen any questions in the chat window, so I'm just going to keep going. But again, if you have questions, just feel free. And happy birthday to everyone who will be a super adult in the next few months. I will try to go get you. I'll try to get you a ticket stub so I can send that over to you. Okay. So we talked about language. Let's talk about ordering labels in a purposeful way. What you can kind of see here, I know they're small, but what you can kind of see here on this slide is 4 random tables from 4 random economics journals. And what you can see in the way that the results on race are ordered is that they always follow a basic standard ordering, which is white, Black, American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian Pacific Islander, Hispanic, and other. And it's always ordered in that way. Same thing with gender. It's always ordered in the binary, and it's always ordered male and then female. And the question, of course, that we should ask ourselves is why do people always place the majority group, whites and males, in the first position as if it's the norm, as if it's the default, as if it's the place to start? And it turns out that when you sort of think about the social science world, at least in the US, this ordering is really not that surprising because this is the way most data sets, particularly from the Census Bureau and other large federal government data agencies, collect and produce these data. So for example, this is from the 2020 decennial census question on race. So the first option here, so you can see there's a bunch of checkboxes. So you basically get to the question, you find your race or your identity, and you check the box. So the first option here is white. And then you can see there's like a line of boxes below that. So you can write in more details. And you can see that there's a prompt here. The prompt is white. Print, for example, German, Irish, English, Italian, Lebanese, Egyptian, etc. And what we saw after the 2020 census results came out is that people, particularly Lebanese, Egyptian, Middle Eastern, and North African folks, objecting to this suggestion that they are somehow white. And what we have now seen that was published just a few months ago is newer recommendations that that group, Middle Eastern and Northern African people, are going to get their own category on census questions. So we're going to see a pretty dramatic change going forward. But let's just look at the ordering here. So we have the first option is for white, second option is Black or African American, then we see American Indian, Alaska Native. We have a number of different categories below that, Chinese, Vietnamese, Native Hawaiian, and so on, and then some other race at the bottom. That's the census. This is the current population survey, also from the Census Bureau. 6 options. 1 is white, 2 is Black, all the way down to 6 is other. And those numbers matter because those numbers there on the left, that's how the data are encoded in the underlying data sets. So you could get the data and you could calculate the average race. It's a meaningless number, but you can do it, right? It's coded by number, not as a string variable. And so it's not surprising to me that you see this order in lots of publications because people get the data, they calculate their means, and then they just sort it by the code. And so you see this, I would say this bias towards the majority group reflected in our dissemination products. And you can see this all over the place. The survey of income and program participation. 1 is white, 2 is Black, 6 is other, and D is don't know. The survey of consumer finances from the Federal Reserve Board. 1 is white, 2 is Black. So all these different reports and studies basically use this default ordering. And the question we need to ask ourselves, particularly on the data communication, on the data visualization side, is can we do something different that doesn't necessarily place white people, males, in that first position as the norm, as the default? So I want to give you just 2 examples here. So take a look at this table. This is from the Brookings Institution. They collected data on the number of PhD economists in each of the Federal Reserve banks. So I'm going to ask you 2 questions here. First question, and you can use the chat window, how are the banks sorted in that first column? You can just throw your answer. Now we're going to get like 300, well, not 300 answers, but we're going to get a whole bunch of answers here. Great, you all see it. Okay, you all see it, it's alphabetical. Terrific. Now let's look across the first row, across the columns. How are the racial groups sorted in that first row? Stephanie says not alphabetical. Yeah, that is true. It is definitely not alphabetical. Tracy says white and then alphabetical. I mean, yes. It kind of depends. Sometimes you put the numbers at the beginning or the end of the alphabet. A couple of people are saying numbers. It's not sorted by number, right? It's not. If you look in that first row or the last row, it's definitely not sorted by number, right? So it's unclear how it's sorted, but however they decided, they certainly put white in the first group, in that first column as the norm, as the default, as the thing to which we start with. Take a totally different example. I don't know if CVS still does COVID tests, but at one point I needed a COVID test back a couple of years ago, and you have to answer all these questions, and they get to the question on race. And notice here that the options on race are sorted alphabetically. And it might feel or seem a little strange to see the 3 options, other, patient refused, and unknown, kind of in the middle of this drop-down menu. But at least it's just alphabetical. And, you know, we can just sort of, it's the one thing we can all agree on these days. The letter B comes after the letter A in the alphabet, right? We can kind of agree on that. I'll say kind of. But again, that alphabetical ordering, you don't have to really make any decisions about that. But there's a broader question of how should we think about ordering the results in our tables, in our charts, in our graphs, or in the surveys themselves. So I'm going to give you some things to think about. I'm not going to give you answers. I'm not going to give you guidelines. I'm not going to give you rules. Just things to think about. Marlene, I love that comment about CVS shortening their receipts. Yes, it's like a novel every time you go. Okay, so things to think about. Does your study or your project focus on a particular community or particular group? And if it does, that group should be presented first. Like that's just that I think is just good data communication. Present the group that you are focusing on, present them first. Is there a particular argument or a particular story you're trying to tell? If so, the order of the data in your table or your bar chart or whatever should reflect that argument. And then finally, perhaps there's a quantitative relationship that you can use that can guide your decision. Alphabetically, population size, sample size, weighted or unweighted, the magnitude of the results, whatever it is. And if you use population size, at least in the US, for the country as a whole, the white group would show up first. But at least you've made a conscious decision about how you're going to sort or order or present your groups, right? So these aren't rules. These are just questions to ask yourself or ask your team, and to make this sort of more conscious decision. I think if we can be more conscious and more thoughtful about this, we're going to end up in a better place. Okay, so I've talked about language and I've talked about ordering. So now let's talk about missing groups. And what I'm thinking about here is not missing data. So, you know, you get your survey results and, you know, some person didn't answer the question on income, or someone didn't, you know, there's missing data, and there's lots of statistical ways to deal with missing individuals. What I'm talking about here is people or communities for whom there is no option in the survey to identify, to place their identity. And for me, the sort of obvious place here is on gender, right? We know gender is not binary, and yet every survey, and many more that I just showed you, the question on gender is always binary. And it's always ordered male coded as 1 and female coded as 2, which is not, I mean, it's only two options. So it's reverse alphabetical, but it's not alphabetical. It's not sorted alphabetically, and it's not sorted by the population size, at least in the United States, right? So we always have this default ordering of putting male in that first position. Now, I will say there are surveys that are working to expand these the options in the gender question, which I'll talk about in a second. But there are also bad ways to ask this question. Here are 4 of my favorite bad ways to ask this question. I go back and forth on which one is kind of my favorite bad way. So I identify as male. I would not know which of the 3 options to pick in the top right, male, female, or human. I kind of feel like 2 are a subset of the third. Although the one in the bottom left is also pretty great, like what's your gender, a male, female, or I have no plans to purchase a new vehicle. So I don't, whichever one is your favorite. But what are we seeing out in the world? Well, we're seeing some changes, at least on the federal side, of how gender data is collected. And sort of the guidepost right now is this report from the National Academies on collecting gender identity and sexual orientation data. And the basic recommendation from the NASM study is as follows, is to use a 2-step question. And the first question out of the pair asks, what sex were you assigned at birth on your original birth certificate? You can see here that the way NASM is suggesting this are essentially 4 options. Female, male, notice the ordering here is female then male, don't know, and then prefer not to answer. Then the second question asks, what is your current gender? And you can see that there are 5 options here, female, male, transgender. If you've previously identified as American Indian or Alaskan Native, you get a 4th option that's listed as Two-Spirit. And then there's a couple of options below. There's a free text option and then don't know and prefer not to answer. So, and I see some comments here that are already sort of reflecting some of the challenges with these questions. So there are several problems, or I don't want to say problems, but challenges with these questions. The first challenge is, let me just say who else is doing this. So the Pulse survey, the Census Bureau Pulse survey that started during the pandemic, they're using this 2-step question. However, they've done some imputation for people who did not answer the second question. And what you see in the imputation is a tremendous bias to overestimating the share of people who identify as transgender male or transgender female. So that's a particular issue that's coming that you're seeing. Also, the National Crime Victimization Survey uses the basic NASM approach as well. But again, there's 2 issues here. The first issue is that the word transgender is not a noun. The word transgender is an adjective. So technically speaking, there should not be an option for transgender. There should be an option for transgender male and then a separate option for transgender female. And also, I think I saw someone make this point. It's unclear how someone who is a transgender male, transgender female would answer this question, right? What if they are in the process of their transition? What if they are done with their transition and they don't identify as a transgender person at all? They identify as male or female. So there's a lot of underlying challenges here, but the overarching point here is that the word transgender is not a noun. And then secondly, there are currently about 16 states, 15 states plus Washington, D.C., where parents can place an X marker on a child's birth certificate. So in about, when those kids will be adults in about 15 years. So when those kids hit adulthood, that first question, that's male or female, is isn't going to work, right? So we're going to need a change as we move forward to broaden even that first question about what is your gender noted on your birth certificate. So you can see that there's a lot of challenges here, and we go into a lot more detail on a lot of these in the most recent report in the Do No Harm series. Okay, but let's get back to race. So what I have here are the 6 major race categories from the 2019 American Community Survey. And I'm going to estimate the poverty rate for each of these 6 groups. So this is not the official poverty rate, just sort of a relatively kind of quick tab. And you see a fairly strict gradient here from about 10% to almost 24% for that top group. The thing that we need to keep in mind is that even though we're using these aggregate groups, that there's lots of variation within these groups. So as you noticed earlier, you can check the box for, say, American Indian or Alaskan Native, and then you can write in more details. And so if you go in, at least in this year, there are about 140 more detailed categories. And if you do the same exercise and estimate the poverty rate for all those 140 groups, you get a much different picture. You see much more variation in these estimates of the poverty rate, from about 5% for the bottom group, from about 5% to almost 30%. Now, it's worth recognizing that there's large variation in the sample size. This is the same graph where the bubbles are scaled by sample size. But the sample sizes also reflect what our institutions and our structures have been built on for the last 200 years, right? And the way that we ask questions, the groups that we reach out to, the groups that we actually include in our surveys. So if we want to make statistically meaningful comparisons, we do need to keep in mind these differences in sample sizes. But I think what we then can just do from a conceptual standpoint is to just recognize and acknowledge that there's a lot of variation going on behind our aggregate groups that we don't always necessarily use, or we don't even necessarily see. And so we need to just keep that in mind as we're working through our data, as we're collecting our data, or as we're publishing our data. The other point I wanted to make here was on the word other, because in all those surveys, you saw the word other as this sort of catch-all category. And there's no better way to other a person or other a community by literally making them identify as other. So I wanted to dive into this a little bit more. And it was really interesting. So my first step was to go to the dictionary. And here's a screenshot from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. And this I thought was really interesting. The fifth entry in the dictionary is disturbingly or threateningly different. And so there is some connotation within the dictionary, right? There is this connotation around the word other, that this group, this person is somehow a disturbance, somehow a threat, right? To whom, I don't know, but that's the definition of the word. And so the question we then, as folks who are either creating or consuming data, is what can we use as some alternatives to the word other? And so a lot of people that I've spoken to has suggested the word and other as an alternative, which grammatically doesn't quite match up, but I think we can all sort of get over that. But we've thought about and collected some additional alternatives to the word other. So here are 7 that you can consider using: another race or races, additional groups, all other self-descriptions, people identifying as other or multiple races, identity not listed, and identity not listed in the survey. I will say just 2 things about this. One, these are all factually true. So when the person comes to the question and they check the box for the word other, it is factually true that their identity is not listed in the survey. And secondly, initially, I had some reservations about using one of these other phrases, because it is still true that the survey respondent, the person selected the option for the word other. So as someone who's using the data and reporting on it, is it okay for me to change that word? And I've sort of gotten over that a bit. And I just kind of say now, like, sometimes, most of the time, I'll add a footnote or an endnote or a note somewhere that just says, the Census Bureau uses the word other. I'm going to use the phrase identity not listed. But honestly, I don't even know if most people really care. I mean, I think it's just better to get away from the othering and just use one of these, or I'm sure there are other phrases that people have used. Regardless of how you feel about the word other or these alternatives, I think we can all agree that when CNN calls a group something else, and I know I've seen this in some of these lunchtime talks in the past, I think we can all agree that this is not how you want to refer to people or refer to communities. And so I think we can sort of all agree on that, but think about some of these alternatives to the word other. Okay, with my last few minutes, I want to talk about color with taking your racial equity awareness. And again, I want to base this in an example. And again, I'll zoom in here in a second, so you don't need to squint. This is a dashboard from MIT. They call it their Student Diversity Dashboard. The line chart on the left part of this dashboard, this is a Tableau dashboard they produce. The line chart on the left shows trends in the number, or maybe the share of students in each of the different racial categories over time. And then the stack chart on the right is a breakdown within different colleges within the university. Okay, so that's how the dashboard is set up. Let's look at the legend. So as you can see here, we have 9 different categories. Black or African American students in the top left there in the dark black color, or sorry, dark red color. In the top right category, 2 or more races in that lighter red color. White students in the blue colors, and then international students and unknown students who didn't record their race in the gray colors. Okay, I see Stephanie says this legend sucks. I totally agree. I'm going to let you answer this question. There are several problems with this color palette. Want to just tell me what they are? Just throw it into throw why you think this is a bad color palette into the chat window. Okay, so Laura hits the first one. Yeah, there's little contrast, right? That the variation in those red colors are really hard to distinguish. I mean, they're easier here because I've listed them out in the legend, but like on a graph, they're going to be hard. Tara says red implies a problem. Yeah, I mean, especially in Western cultures, right? Red is sort of has that negative connotation around it. Trying to look quickly here. A couple of you have said the biggest one, I think, that white students are the only group they get their own color. So the implication or the inference here, the suggestion here is that what we should be doing is comparing all these groups to the white category because that's the norm, that's the default, that's the thing that we should be comparing to. And I've seen a couple of people mention the grays, that grays are sort of like fade to the background in data visualization. That's true. And also international is not a race. Like it's just not, okay? I also wanted to mention one other thing, and maybe someone missed it. I apologize. There's a lot of comments, which is terrific. That this red sequential color palette suggests a hierarchical ordering, just the way our choropleth map did a few minutes ago, right? In there, light colors were low unemployment rates, dark colors were high unemployment rates. And so here the implication is that somehow Black or African American students are more than or greater than Asian students or students who identified as 2 or more races. Now, I just want to say, I know I'm criticizing this visualization, but I want to be clear that I just, in my heart of hearts, I don't believe that the person who created this created it from a position of malice or racism. They just didn't know, right? And as Stephanie says, their own form of implicit bias, right? And I think that is, but I don't sort of ascribe sort of a malicious intent on their part. So what happened? That was June of 2020. July of 2020, after some, let's call it gentle pushback, but only gentle for Twitter, not gentle for how we would treat each other in person. How, you know, gentle for Twitter. They changed the color palette, and I'll zoom in here, and this is what they did. And they made some changes, but at its core, you still have these shades of blue into green. But I'll also say that, it's not easy to pick 9 distinct colors, right? Color Brewer is one of the more popular color tools out there. And if I go in and say, give me 9 colors, like you still get shades of reds and greens. Like it's not easy to pick 9 distinct colors, which leads me to my last point in thinking about whether we should be using a single graph or using small multiples, and small multiples just being smaller multiple charts. So my last point here, this is a graph of the poverty rates for 5 of those aggregate racial and ethnic groups. And I think what happens, we create graphs like this all the time. But I think what happens when we create groups like this, or create graphs like this, I should say, is that we kind of generate like a horse race effect, in that whatever is the best performing group becomes the norm, becomes the default, becomes the goal, right? Our goal from a policy perspective is not to drive the poverty rate down to whatever the poverty rate is for the white group, the lowest poverty rate group, right? The goal is to drive poverty rate down as low as possible for everybody. Like that's the goal that we should be striving towards from a policy perspective. And so from a data visualization perspective, maybe we should just use a small multiples approach. And so here, I've broken these 5 groups onto 5 different graphs. The dotted yellow line is the national average. Now, people may still want to try to compare these groups, but what I'm not going to do as the content creator is create that horse race effect. I will also say that some people have told me I'm not going far enough, that really this should be 5 graphs on 5 separate pages or 5 separate slides. I don't, from a conceptual perspective, I don't necessarily disagree with that. But from a practical perspective, I think when someone opens your report and it's 25 pages, they are more inclined to read that than if you open it and it's page 1 of 90. Like, I just think like there's a practical consideration that we have to sort of balance here. I will also just take a kind of like half step back, and that sometimes maybe having these groups on one graph is something we should do. This is from a graph in one of the collected volumes of these Do No Harm guides. So from another pair of authors. And what this is showing is the time trend in suicide rates among teens across these 5 different racial ethnic groups. And what you can see here is that the suicide rate among Native American teens is much higher and rising much more quickly among that group than these other 4 groups. But in this case, I think what we're trying to do here is highlight the disparities. And I think when we're trying to highlight disparities, I think maybe, I'm not putting a firm foot down here because I think this is something that's still worthy of discussion. But I think when we're trying to highlight disparities, we actually do want to put these groups on the same graph, as opposed to the sort of nuanced, subtle distinction between the other one when we are sort of suggesting that there's a racial or ethnic or identity group that is the best performing, that's our goal. So I'm just gonna put this up to close up here. I always put this up for myself primarily. I was trained as a quantitative researcher, even though I've been doing a lot more qualitative research over the last few years. But I think it's important for all of us to remember that data are a reflection of the lives of real people, right? They have given a part, when people answer a survey, they give a part of themselves to the survey, to the interviewer. And we as data collectors, as data consumers, as data communicators, we need to respect that and understand that, and think about, again, just to come back all the way full circle, think about how you would want to be presented or shown in a visualization, and the words that are used, the colors that are used, the descriptions, the icons, whatever it might be. And if you can take that more empathetic approach, I think you're going to end up in visualization products that are better and more equitable and more inclusive, and ultimately more likely to be used. So I know I'm right at the hour. I asked Heather if I should be short or go long. She said, just go long. Like, people want to hear this. So, but thank you all so much. And thank you for everybody for the comments. Really appreciate it.
Totally agree. And you can see everybody in the chat also agrees go long is the right answer when you are Dr. Jon Schwabish, because there is so much high quality information. Again, thank you so much, Jon, for making time in your schedule for sharing this. And I do promise it'll take us a little while, maybe a day, but the video and all of these links will be up for you to access, because I know that you, somebody's saying one of the best TDE webinars. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We're back next Friday with some researchers from RTI who are going to talk about an innovative new method about trying to understand really small groups of people in the geographies in which they live. So we will be back next Friday. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you for being part of the community. And Jon, again, thanks for joining us. Bye, everybody.
Bye all. Thank you.